And I just really believe that one of the things that we're doing here in Bastiat Society is networking, getting to know different people who are committed to the same cause. And this is a refuge. This is a place where people come, just like Kent was saying, because he's here with the Mises group, right? And you know, we got to stick together. One other thing I wanted to mention before Jenna is that in November this year we're going to have Jen LaGreca, who is with Winged Victory, and she's an incredible artist and novelist, really, who's committed to liberty and creates stories. And she wrote this incredible book, Just the Truth, which has been made into a movie. And I'd like you guys should try to. We have several months to grab a book. She's autograph it, read it, get into it, figure it out what she's about. It's really cool. Richard knows her. Good, and you know, if Richard knows her, then she's great. Anyway, Jenna, sorry.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm here to introduce George Leef, and my apologies, my introduction is not going to be a formal one because Brad told me about 3 minutes ago that I was going to do this. But I have known George for a very long time. We've worked together since 2007 at the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. So I think I know most of George's bio. George has worked on higher education issues for a large part of his career. He has been especially prolific and ahead of the curve in writing about things like the overselling of higher education. He has been in the forefront of the fight against racial preferences in higher education. And he's been doing great work recruiting authors, writing for the National Review. He has previously written for the Freeman, and so many outlets that I cannot name them. But most frequently, I think, for NRO and for us. George also previously worked at Northwood University where he taught. And like Brad, he also moonlights in a way that you wouldn't expect. You might hear George on WCPE, which is our local classical channel. He frequently hosts programs, and so sometimes, you know, I turn on the radio on my way to work in the morning, and I'm like, hey, that's George. So tune in to WCPE, and you can catch him there, or you can catch him doing work for the Martin Center on Higher Education. So please join me in welcoming George Leef.
Thanks very much, Jenna. Pleasure to be here this evening. I've entitled this talk, Takers versus Makers, the Battle for America's Future. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, but our country is in deep trouble. I'm afraid that we are near, or perhaps even past, the point of no return in the battle to preserve freedom. Now, as you all know, humans frequently have illnesses. We'll catch a cold or something worse, we fight it off, we get back to full health. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the illness so weakens us that we can't fight it off, we weaken and die. There's a point of no return beyond which recovery is impossible. And my question is whether the United States may have not passed that point. Now, of course, our illness is not a physical one like cancer. Rather, it is a political and philosophical illness. We have largely abandoned the nation's foundations of individual liberty, private property, limited government under the Constitution, in favor of a socialistic philosophy under which your property is not secure, under which the law is whatever officials declare it to be, and the way to get what you want is now to beg government officials to give it to you. The way I like to put it is that the takers are overwhelming the makers. That is to say, those who want to live by taking away from others now outnumber and have far more political clout than do the people who just want to be left alone. Moreover, the proportions are rapidly shifting in favor of the takers. In recent years, the percentage of Americans who support themselves has been dropping, and the percentage of those who live off the taxes collected from the remaining makers has been increasing rapidly. Moreover, the power of the government to impose upon remaining makers has been growing apace. And most troubling of all, the takers have unleashed a fantastic propaganda onslaught through which the media and our schools are capturing the minds of people, turning them against their country and against the concept of freedom itself. Adam Smith once observed, there is much ruin in a nation, and that is true. A strong nation is like a healthy human person, able to absorb quite a lot of abuse, but not an unlimited amount. Throughout our history, we've experienced many harmful policies, but we recovered, survived. Now, however, the cumulative effect of the past harmful policies and new ones that are looming just ahead of us will have disastrous consequences, I fear. Now let's talk about the takers. They are people who have no compunctions whatsoever about depriving other people of their property and living at their expense. Mostly they believe, as President Obama said, you didn't build that. You're not really entitled to your wealth. So it's okay if the government takes it away from you and gives it to them. And of course, the government has, in their view, an inexhaustible fountain of wealth. It can always tax the rich. It can always borrow more money and just print it up. The takers never give any thought to the scarcity of resources or to the effects their policies will have on the incentives to produce goods and services. And then equally, if not more dangerous, is another trait amongst the takers, namely their eagerness to deprive other people of their liberty. They don't cherish the idea of a free society. In fact, they dislike it. Society, they think, should be under the control of deep-thinking, highly educated people like themselves, not left up to the chaos and uncontrolled liberty of market competition. Now, going back more than a century, the people who call themselves progressives have been working to undermine our traditions of liberty, capitalism, and the rule of law in favor of what they view as scientific management of society by government officials. Those officials will know just how to make society perfect through a combination of taxes, regulations, mandates, prohibitions, and subsidies. They reject Adam Smith's idea of a spontaneous order in favor of a centrally planned society. Now, it just also happens that society like that creates a lot of secure, high-paying jobs for people like themselves. And that's much nicer than the rough and tumble world of capitalism, where the demand for busybodies is pretty much non-existent. The progressive worldview is actually similar to the ancient system of feudalism, where a few elites at the top ran everything. Ordinary people just did what they were told to do. It's a very regressive system that would make us poor and miserable. But those who favor this great global reset, like German billionaire Klaus Schwab, says that in the future you will own nothing and be happy. I don't agree, and I don't want to find out. Now, the takers have a philosophy that's the exact opposite of that which dominated in early America. Most Americans used to believe in a live and let live golden rule kind of philosophy. They were content to let others do what they wanted to as long as they were peaceful about it. The takers, however, are bossy, intolerant, and perfectly content with using coercion to get their way. Now, the United States was a great success because the takers used to have no power. But now they do, and we need to be very worried about it. Now, I've been worried for a long time. But the anxiety level hit its peak in the summer of 2020. The Democrats had just nominated Joe Biden, and the left-wing chattering class in America was giddy with delight about all that they were going to do once they swept the elections. And of course, you probably remember how they talked about transforming America, such as packing the Supreme Court, gutting the Second Amendment, imposing an economic reset to eliminate the last vestiges of capitalism, to make college free, and enact no new pro-union laws. Many, many things to reset America. And that got me to thinking, what if they get their way? What would America be like after 8 years of that kind of unchallenged power in the hands of the takers? Well, it got me thinking, why don't you try writing a book? I never written fiction before, but I thought, give it a try. And The Awakening of Jennifer Van Arsdale, published just about 1 year ago, is sort of my thought experiment on what would happen if we had that terrible scenario of complete taker domination. Now, before we get back to America's perilous situation, let's talk a bit about the use of language. George Orwell correctly observed that by controlling language, rulers can dominate the way people think, which of course is always favorable to their continuing power. Now, I like to encourage the precise use of English so people can think clearly. Now, let's consider the word liberal. In common usage in the United States, liberal politicians are those like Obama and Biden, who want to expand government power. The problem, of course, is that liberal means the belief in liberty, allowing people to live their lives free of coercion. Adam Smith was one of the original liberals. He argued against policies that made people subject to control by government. Frederick Bastiat was another early liberal, arguing that the common people would be better off with economic freedom as opposed to the tight regulation of the French aristocracy. It was back during the New Deal that politicians who favored increasing federal economic control began to call themselves liberals. But that was a misapplication of the word, since what they wanted was the exact opposite of what liberals favored. They wanted more control over people, not less. And today it's simply absurd to call someone like Joe Biden a liberal, since his every instinct is authoritarian. So in the interest of clarity, I insist on calling the people who want to use more and more laws and regulations to dominate us statists. Let's not call them liberals. They're not liberals, they are statists. Now, the takers have lots of other little language tricks up their sleeve, but I'd like to turn now to our history and talk about how we got to the present situation. Now, every society, I imagine, that's ever existed has had some percentage of people who want to live at the expense of others, tell them how they should live their lives. The takers, in other words. In the United States, however, the takers at first found themselves with absolutely no traction. And that's because we had no nobility, so everyone had to work. Nobody was entitled to anything. And, crucially, the law protected liberty and property against the incursions of takers. The government was given no authority to take from some to give to others. Back when James Madison, father of the Constitution, served in the House of Representatives, a bill was introduced that would have given relief money to the victims of a fire in Georgetown. Madison, however, took to the floor and shot it down, saying, "I cannot lay my finger upon the article of the Constitution which grants the right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents." So in those days, we took seriously the limits on government power. And because the law protected liberty and property, if someone wanted your money for a good cause, he had to ask for it and had to take no for an answer if you chose to decline. Now, Americans often did contribute money and goods and work to help the needy, but coercion was not allowed. Americans knew that their property was safe to use as they chose, and that taxation was very light since government had little to do. Under those conditions, the economy flourished. Immigrants began flocking to our shores, leaving behind countries where the heavy hand of government control stifled their ambitions. Here, you could succeed on your own merits. When Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States in 1830, he marveled at the incessant industry of the people, who were far more productive than most Europeans. Freedom worked. Living standards were rising for all. Now, in an excellent book on the horrendously misleading 1619 Project, historian Phil Magnus, who we had here just a few months ago, writes about the American economy. I quote, "Capitalism was not proclaimed, adopted, imposed, or arrived at a moment in time. In the classical liberal sense, capitalism simply refers to a set of conditions and circumstances that are favorable to voluntary human interactions and that are distinguished by the absence of centralized design. It describes a number of attributes in an economy: a freedom in the exchange and movement of goods and people, a general recognition of the validity of private property, and a stable and discernible system of contracts built upon it, a cultural environment of toleration for choice and discovery, and a worldview that, at least in its professed values, deprecates forceful predation. That was America for its first century and more. Now, under that system, which is actually the lack of a system, it's what happens when you just leave people alone, things were great. But in time, takers started to figure out how they could get things from government. The earliest, tariffs. Manufacturers figured out they could go to the government and say, please protect us against these terrible goods coming in from Europe. So they had figured out, go to government, take some freedom away from consumers, and you'll benefit. Somewhat later, businesses figured out they could get subsidies from the government for internal improvements like canals. Use coercion, get some money from the taxpayers, line your pockets. And then by the 1870s, the takers were really getting some traction. For instance, interest groups formed to lobby the governments and states for laws that would restrict the freedom of contract of other people. A good example, the Grangers in the Midwestern states lobbied for laws that would put limits on what the grain elevator owners could charge. And that was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1877, Munn versus Illinois. And the Supreme Court said that when there's a public interest affecting property, well, the public interest takes precedence over freedom of contract. So now the takers were really getting someplace. And then soon we had populist and socialist candidates running for office, promising wealth redistribution. And by the early 1900s, we had an intellectual class, something we never had in the early days. People spouting off about the reforms they wanted in society. People like Herbert Crowley, founder of New Republic, wrote an influential book entitled The Promise of American Life, where he argued in favor of replacing the messy, chaotic system of liberty and capitalism with scientific control in the hands of experts. And they started calling themselves progressives and set their sights on transforming the country, expunging the old-fashioned American beliefs in economic freedom and limited government, replacing them with their vision of a benign, expert managerial state. And to do that, they targeted 3 key elements for takeover: the education system, the media, and the legal profession. And in time, their efforts would be monumentally successful. Those 3 elements of society are now completely dominated by people sympathetic to the taking agenda. Then in 1912, Woodrow Wilson was elected president, an avowed progressive. And the following year, we committed 2 of the greatest blunders in our history: the 16th Amendment, allowing the federal government to impose a graduated income tax, and the institution of the Federal Reserve System. Now, those were like 2 small tumors at first. 2 small cancerous tumors. We didn't even notice them at first, but in turn, they would grow into huge malignancies. Then in 1917, Wilson dragged the U.S. into the Great War. He and his fellow progressives were delighted to expand government power over the economy, to regiment it for war, and also to crack down on freedom of speech, an authoritarian trait we often see since they don't like dissenters against their policies. After the war, the progressives were sad when President Harding dismantled the government economic controls, and were sadder still when his successor, Calvin Coolidge, actually cut the federal budget, something that has not happened since 1928. During the Roaring 20s, things seemed pretty good. The U.S. seemed to be the picture of health, but appearances were deceiving. As we know, in 1929, the Depression hit, And the statist intellectuals blamed it on capitalism, saying a free market economy is inherently unstable. The only way out, they said, was for the federal government to engineer recovery with all kinds of spending and government regulation. And at the time, almost no one understood that the real culprit was the Federal Reserve's erratic policies, not capitalism. And only a very few economists could foresee that government intervention, which began under Hoover and was greatly accelerated under Roosevelt, would prolong and deepen the Depression. So the takers capitalized on the nation's distress to put in place policies that they had long advocated: minimum wage laws, welfare, price controls, pro-union legislation, Social Security, a high income tax, and much more. Roosevelt's New Deal, of course, did not get the country out of the Depression, but a dutiful and friendly media class kept telling people he was doing all the right things. During World War II, of course, the government greatly increased its power still further. As Ambrose Bierce once sagely observed, war is the health of the state, and indeed it proved to be. And after the war, government control ratcheted down somewhat, but not entirely. The late 40s and 50s were a time of divided government and stasis in the country, but those malignant tumors I had mentioned kept on growing. The takers strengthened their positions in the media, in education, and legal profession. Then following the assassination of President Kennedy, there was a tidal wave of government growth that the takers wanted. They got it under Lyndon Johnson. More welfare, Medicare and Medicaid, putting the government firmly into the medical business. New regulatory agencies such as housing and urban development, and arguably the most damaging of all, federal subsidies for higher education. Luring more and more young people into college with easy money would give the takers an enormous advantage in promoting their agenda. And ever since then, we've had steady governmental growth under both Republican and Democratic presidents. The reach of the government has expanded and its costs has exploded. I can recall Senator Everett Dirksen back in the 1960s saying $1 million here, $1 million there. Soon we're talking about real money. Well, today, replace million with trillion. And as if this weren't bad enough, the takers of today are really a different breed from the old-fashioned ones. Politicians like JFK, for instance, were just content to skim off some of the great productivity of capitalism, distribute the welfare, the benefits to their supporters, and be happy. They never thought about killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. They were smarter than that. But now we have politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who have been schooled to hate capitalism, to revile it, to want to replace it. And they have huge followings. Now, another change in the current takers, the old-timers used to at least respect freedom of speech. The new ones do not. The intellectuals in the 60s and 70s used to pride themselves on using First Amendment rights to speak truth to power. But now that the takers are in power, they prefer to denigrate freedom of speech. Law professors now write articles saying how the First Amendment has to be junked, and we must have controls on speech in the public interest. The government finds ways of clamping down on information it dislikes, such as with the Hunter Biden stories, and to frighten people into submission into its COVID mandates. The administration has even proposed a flagrantly unconstitutional disinformation governing board that would no doubt further slant the flow of information. In short, the United States is seeing unprecedented threats to what remains of our freedom. Remember those tumors? Well, they're growing, and they're really making an impact on our economy. One impact that's quite evident is the slowing of economic growth since the 1970s. Starting in the 70s, there's been a decline in the rate of GDP growth that's been noticeable. We'd be a much wealthier country today if it had not been for that decline in our economic growth. Economist Adam Thierer persuasively says that it's due to the onset of what he calls the permission society, And what he means by that is that in order to build things, to start businesses, try innovations, today you usually have to get permission from some government bureaucrats. In sum, the takers have gained tremendous ground, and as a result, the United States is a much less free, less prosperous, and less innovative country than it otherwise would have been. So, what are the prospects like for regaining our health? Can we somehow overcome these multiple and highly malignant tumors spreading within the nation? I think the prospects are grim. Look at the opposing sides. What do the takers have going for them? What do the makers have to defend against them? Well, first of all, the takers have the White House and the Senate. They did lose control of the House in the midterm elections, very narrowly, by a remarkably small margin, in fact, given the terrible things that are happening in the United States. The takers control the vast federal bureaucracy, which can and does impose new rules almost at will, such as the Consumer Product Safety Commission wanting to ban gas stoves, and the Center for Disease Control thinking it can stop evictions for non-payment of rent. And the Department of Energy, of course, is on a crusade against fossil fuels. The takers have no compunction about restricting your freedom, and there's no stopping point. They always want more. There's always something else they think has got to be subject to their control. What about money? Well, amongst the big philanthropic institutions, those allied with the takers have about 4 to 5 times the funds those allied with makers do. But far more important than that is the ability of the takers to spend public funds to advance their agenda and reward their friends. Did you know, for example, that Biden's so-called American Rescue Plan ladles $36 billion of taxpayer money into the bailout of the Teamsters pension fund? It's a good thing to do if you have the control of the federal government. Use taxpayer money to reward your friends. What about the media? Well, with very few exceptions, the media is overwhelmingly on the side of the takers. For the most writers in America, objectivity is just kind of an old-fashioned alien concept. They believe it is their place to slant every story so it aids the cause of big government. Every problem is discussed as if the only possible solution was more government control. Also, the media will dutifully write hit pieces on the motives or morality of anyone who dares to challenge their agenda. Now, on the side of the makers, what do we have going? Well, we do have a few excellent writers, few fine publications. They don't get read by nearly as many people. And then there's the education system. It has been almost entirely taken over by the takers, and they use it to spread their ideas and ridicule and discredit any criticism of them. They've been doing that for decades, but lately the brazenness of their manipulation of our schools to push their statist agenda has become truly amazing. For example, the 1619 Project materials that are widely used in schools and colleges, despite the fact that all of it has been shown to be historically false. Doesn't matter though, whether it's true or false. What matters is it advances the statist agenda. They want American students to think of us as a fatally flawed country, and that our institutions have to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Truth or falsity simply doesn't matter to them. We also find that materials incorporating critical race theory, which of course is extremely divisive and degrading, is being used in our schools. But when parents complain about that, they're called terrorists by the education establishment and even the Attorney General of the United States. The curriculum of our schools and colleges pretty much saturated with taker propaganda. They set out to capture the education system years ago, and they've done it. Now, to counter that, we have a very small number of schools and colleges that still just teach courses without an overlay of ideology. They are overwhelmingly outnumbered. Now, on our side, we also have some great thinkers who make compelling arguments in favor of liberty. Adam Smith, Frederick Bastiat, Ludwig von Mises, Thomas Sowell and many others. The problem is that few Americans read books at all any longer, much less learned scholarly ones. And furthermore, most of them have been trained to automatically dismiss any such scholars because they are supposedly racist or fascist or some other slur. Our schools don't teach students to think, they teach them to emote. Now, if we analogize the current situation, the battle between the takers and the makers, to a chess game, it looks extremely lopsided, people. The takers have far more pieces on the board, and they believe that checkmate is just a few moves away. They may be right. And here's what that checkmate will entail. It would mean permanent statist control over all the branches of government. Much as they proclaim their dedication to our democracy, they want to make certain that they can never be voted out of power. They want to cement themselves into control and reduce the remnant of critics to a helpless condition. That's us, people. Harassed and silenced by federal agencies, fading away as the media and education system erases all memory of our once free, liberal society. In other words, folks, they've read 1984, and they take it as a model. And then what? Well, under control by the takers, the U.S. will steadily decline in prosperity and innovation. That's what always happens to countries when they abandon liberty in favor of security and equality. People will work less because rewards are slight. They'll consume capital rather than to invest it. Ambitious individuals will leave for other countries where they won't be reviled and exploited. You might think of the U.S. as like California today. People leaving. But where will people go if the U.S. becomes California writ large? Our politics will become increasingly bitter as interest groups fight for increasing shares of the shrinking economic pie. The ruling takers will turn increasingly totalitarian as conditions worsen. I would bet that the U.S., which used to be rated as the world's third freest economy in the Heritage Foundation's rankings, now at 25th, will sink further fast and become in the partially free category or mostly unfree category, along with countries like Argentina. Now, Argentina is a useful case to look at. At the turn of the 20th century, Argentina was the second most prosperous country in the Western Hemisphere. Now, after nearly a century there of control by illiberal populists, it's a poor, inflation-racked country governed by arrogant, corrupt politicians. That, I'm afraid, is our destiny if we don't pull out of the nosedive. And let me mention just one more disaster which I see looming ahead. The takers have decided that we must rid ourselves of fossil fuels and go completely green in order to help let the planet heal, as they say. They're on a crusade to eliminate coal, oil, natural gas as fast as possible, replacing it with renewables, wind, solar panels. Now, are there any risks in doing that? Putting all of our energy eggs in one basket? Well, imagine that a huge volcanic eruption were to spew so much ash into the skies that sunlight is blocked out for an extended period of time. Fanciful? Oh no. That's happened many times in history. It happened in 1815. A vast eruption in Indonesia led to the year without a summer here in 1816. Crops failed. It snowed in July. That could happen again. And now that we have a much bigger population dependent upon energy, what if that were to be the case? What would happen if we had solar panels blocked out, producing little or no energy? People would be freezing. As happened just a couple years ago in Texas, when of the advantages and resources the takers have, do we really have a chance? Is it checkmate? Well, maybe not. Here's one bright spot I can think of. The takers have so badly overplayed their hand with respect to the COVID pandemic that I think a lot of Americans now have doubts about their proclaimed competence and beneficence. It's becoming clearer day by day to many Americans that they were lied to by public officials about the masks, about the vaccines, about the dangers COVID poses, about their dedication to science and much more. And people can see that officials like Anthony Fauci were acting out of arrogance rather than dedication to science and concern for the public interest. They know that government bent to the desires of the teachers' unions in closing the schools and to the profitability of big pharma in demanding vaccines and booster after booster. They see the blatant authoritarianism in the demands that healthy Americans either get the jab or lose their jobs. And they may even have heard about the billions in COVID aid that was captured by fraudsters and how real scientists were silenced and smeared for questioning the government's policies. So I'm hopeful that the takers have so badly damaged their credibility that people will start to question them. Our goal has to be to rekindle the spirit of liberty. The takers have done their utmost to extinguish that torch. It's time for a philosophical counter-revolution to set it ablaze once again. So what can you people do? Well, first of all, if you ever thought about giving money to your alma mater, don't do it. unless it's Hillsdale or Grove City or a tiny number of other schools that don't participate in the taker propaganda. Otherwise, you're just you're hurting yourself by giving them money. And while I'm talking about education, if you know any young people who are going to be going to school, try to make sure they don't go to where they're going to be propagandized. Keep them out of the public schools if you can, but don't assume that private schools are necessarily good. Many of them are thoroughly indoctrinated. Do your homework. Homeschooling is a pretty good option. Now, we could also become very aggressive in propounding our philosophy and countering that of the takers. Write letters to editors. Comment on published articles. Contribute to blogs. You can read and send to friends, family, articles that make good points. There are numerous sites, ones that the takers would like to shut down if they possibly can, where you find good material every day. Some that I particularly like are Cafe Hyatt, Legal Insurrection, and Reason. And how about doing this? Why not ask candidates for public office what laws they would seek to repeal and what spending they'd like to eliminate? And don't settle for vague blather about that. And if you can put your question out in the public manner, it signals that at least some of us are against Leviathan government and want to see it shrink. Well, I hope I've persuaded you that while the hour is late and our situation is dire, the U.S. is not yet a lost cause. The U.S. was the world's first nation founded on the principles of liberty, and if we can't preserve it, I don't think there will be another. So we have a country to save, ladies and gentlemen. In the immortal words of the crew and passengers on Flight 93, let's roll. Thanks. Comments? Start with Jenna.
Sorry. I'll be quick. George, you painted the takers, authoritarian status, whatever you call them, as kind of motivated people who clearly know what they're doing. But I want to push back, and you probably will agree, that some people are just useful idiots. What do you think is the breakdown between people who are, true believers and the ones who are just useful idiots, and they don't know any better?
Yeah, I'm going to guess it's about 3/4 useful idiots and 1/4 connivers.
Those
There
useful
certainly
idiots are persuadable, right?
they might be persuadable if they started to think, hey, my benefits are going to stop if the economic implosion happens. And they might say, well, gee, if I had to work, that wouldn't be great, but it'd be better than nothing. So they might be persuadable. That's the task. Persuade people that the future is dismal if we stay on the current path. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, when you said that the media is lost, I witnessed that myself. I was with those people, and they don't care about making money with films and television. They're political activists, and they care more about pushing political activism, winning awards, going to parties and talking about how wonderful they are and how they're saving the world. And I was with them, I was right next to them.
You're so right.
Yeah.
Most of the people in the media went to American colleges. They went through journalism schools, perhaps, and the ideas that they absorbed in college are almost exclusively pro-taker. They're statists. They believe in everything progressive, the whole green progressive agenda. They've absorbed it all. They don't dare question it, because if they dare question it, well, that their life could be, not their life, but their jobs could be on.
I was in threat of being blackballed. If my agent
Yeah.
knew any of the things I
Right.
believed, he would have dropped me in a second.
Right. We have groupthink, and people are afraid to challenge it, and so it keeps rolling.
Yeah. Well, let me just say that back to One Acting Studio, we are part of the media, and we are pushing back the best that we can, and trying to create a space for conservatives to experience art and entertainment. So,
Good.
yeah.
Bravo.
We're not completely lost. Yeah.
So we have someone fighting the good fight.
Exactly. Yes.
George.
Another wrinkle that I've observed, I've been in the big pharma business for, 38 years. I'm out of it for about 10. But I've also witnessed what's been happening with the drug wars, the cartel, and all the drugs coming across the border, and the fact that they are infiltrating our school systems and creating apathy with the students. Like, who cares? Let's go out and do this. Let's do that. Who cares? Mommy and Daddy will take care of me. Who cares? The government will send me a check. They're not willing to go to work like we all had to and grow up in a very knock-em-sock-em world. Someone's always protecting them. And we're creating a society that's not productive. But I blame a lot of this on what's coming across and what's been coming across over several presidents.
Yeah.
And it's so in front of you right now that, we're being overwhelmed.
Yeah. The public schools used to merely be poor at teaching skills and knowledge. Back in my own teaching career, I was oftentimes astounded at how weak college students were there. They had reading and writing skills at about maybe 5th or 6th grade level back, when I was in fifth grade. They couldn't do math, they were afraid of it, they didn't like reading books. Then things got much worse. Not only are they still bad at teaching those things, they're now supplanting what little actual educational content there used to be. Literature, for instance, math, science. That's been replaced by stuff like critical race theory. That they really teach, that they take seriously. Physics, critical race theory, very important. So many young people go through their K-12 years absorbing day in and day out little lessons that the takers want them to know. Lessons about the environment, lessons about our history, lessons about the economy. And so when they get to college, they're ready to rock and roll. They're a bunch of intolerant social justice warriors. And of course, they don't want to listen to people who are telling them different. If they hear someone who tells them different, here's what's likely to happen. There's a veteran law professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Amy Wax. Several years ago, Amy and a fellow lawyer co-wrote an article in which they said that the key to success in America is old-fashioned bourgeois values. Get married, have a family, work, save. Well, for having written that, she was utterly reviled by the students and faculty at Penn, where she's tenured, a veteran, extremely highly thought of professor. Well, the students said, this is intolerable. She makes us feel bad. We want her gone. Now, the administration at Penn, did it side with the professor and say, well, look, she's entitled to say what she wants to say. If you have an argument, make your argument. Oh, no. At most universities these days, the administration will side with the students. They don't want to get crosswise with these social justice warriors. So they took away Amy Wax's first year civil procedure course, which you've been teaching very well for a long time. Then she said something derogatory about affirmative action at Penn Law School. And the students blew a gasket again. And they said, we can't tolerate this. She makes us feel unsafe, and she's against our values. And again, of course, the administration sided with the students. And even though she has tenure, they are now in the process of revoking tenure and firing her, saying that she doesn't have the right values to teach there any longer. So here we have an elite Ivy League school taken over by people who are so emotionally immature that they can't even put up an argument against someone who disagrees. That is emblematic of what's going on in our education system across the whole country.
Hey, George. Thanks for walking through all of those different concepts and obstacles the nation's facing. So, in the book, you referenced a few times that there was a problem with civil asset forfeiture.
Oh, civil asset forfeiture, yes.
So, yes, obviously if you're Bastiat society, I can't think of a more blatant version of legal plunder. Like
Yeah.
it's law, plunder each other, it's
Yeah.
legal, it's great. So, first, how do you, it seems like in the conclusion of the book, you said that the antidote to corrupt governance is free speech. So then, what is the antidote to civil asset forfeiture?
Okay.
And you also had said that civil asset forfeiture was incentivized by the prohibition of drugs and how that's basically an excuse to seize assets. So then you have the second problem. If you're going to stop prohibiting substances and you're going to unfetter them, you're going to liberate them, you're going to legalize them, well, you could have the introduction of this new problem we've been seeing where you have government granted monopolies, and that is just one devil for another. So first off, what's the antidote to civil asset forfeiture? Second off, if you're going to change policy on drugs, how do you avoid just introducing another problem from expansive government?
Okay, I'll take the first one first. What about civil asset forfeiture? Many of you probably don't even know what that is. Civil asset forfeiture is a set of laws, state and federal, under which government officials, usually it's the police, can confiscate property of yours, it's oftentimes cash, simply alleging it might have come from some illegal activity. Typical case. Somebody is traveling with cash across country to make a purchase, a truck maybe. Gets pulled over at an airport, and the cops see the cash, and they say, well, we're confiscating this because we think it could have come from drug dealing. Then the individual has to go through legal processes to try to get his money back. It's very difficult to do, time consuming. Luckily, Institute for Justice has gotten pretty good at fighting these cases for people, but not everybody knows about the Institute for Justice, and they don't have unlimited resources. If you don't succeed in persuading a judge of your innocence, the government gets to keep your money. It usually goes into the budget of the police department. So they have a tremendous incentive to target hapless, mostly poor, oftentimes minority people, and take their money, take whatever valuables they have with them. They sometimes have stolen cars. In fact, out in New Mexico, they got so adept at taking cars that they made the mistake of putting an online video where the police had actually had a seminar on what cars to target to get the maximum inflow of money under civil asset forfeiture. Well, that video happened to get out in public, and it so outraged the people that New Mexico unanimously passed a law repealing civil asset forfeiture. Quite amazing. Now, I put that in the book because it was one of the things that got Jennifer awakened to the real truth about what government is like. Now, she's a left-wing progressive journalist at first, but stuff happens such that she realizes the government is not what she thought it was. So that's civil asset forfeiture. How do we get rid of it? We have to explain to a whole lot of people that it doesn't help fight drugs. It usually targets people who are perfectly innocent. It's an abuse. It's intolerable. It's an attack on due process of law. We simply have to awaken a lot more people, like the folks out of New Mexico, that civil asset forfeiture has got to go. Thanks. And what about drugs? Well, I'm in favor of legalizing. Whatever, drugs do harm, sure. Trying to prohibit them does even more harm. So deal with the harms without prohibition. Saltzman, Mr. Saltzman.
George, I love your writings. Thanks for coming tonight. Thoughts on things like the University of Austin or the new, what is it called, School for Civic Engagement within UNC?
Yeah.
Basic efforts to carve out either separate universities or OACs within, any thoughts on that whole method versus the old line of just bring better scholars into the existing university?
Yeah, I like the idea of trying to build a parallel education system with institutions like the university down in Austin.
Can you explain that too? Just
Yeah, last year, or I think it was more like 2 years ago, it was announced that there would be a new liberal arts, non-politicized university forming in Austin, Texas, University of Austin in Texas, UATX. And it's going to have good scholars, and it's going to have no politics. It's just going to teach, it's going to be like a college was 100 years ago. I think it's going to succeed. I think it'll draw a lot of students, and maybe it'll lead to a lot more institutions like it. I think that that's going to be a whole lot more successful in trying to fight back against institutions that are already corrupted. Anyone else?
Can I add on to that? I think that there's a huge demand for that. I think there's a much of demand for that as there is for like what we're dealing with the entertainment world. There's a massive hole in the market that needs to be filled, and I think that's part of
the
it.
way you do, you're starting your own alternate company versus trying to,
right.
Get
I tried that. Doesn't work. You got to start your own thing. Yeah, yeah.
And the UNC project, George, is that, what do you think of?
Well, I think it's a darn good idea. And you know why it's a good idea? Because so many people are upset about it. All the right people are angry that this was done, including UNC's wonderful accreditor, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, the organization that somehow missed the great athletics scandal despite its oversight of the university. The fact that all those people are angry makes me think this is a good move. Yeah, Bob.
If we could build on this, if you want to attack this actually and crack the armor, the accreditation system, just let it blow up.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the demand suck by, it'll be interesting to see which corporations beeline to these specific schools and recruit nowhere else, because they know what they're going to get. So that, I think, is going to start to drive more and more and more and more of this to really pull students through, because they know they're going to get people who can think on their feet and do business.
Yeah.
Hey, George, we got to wrap it up, but we have
Sure.
one more question or comment or anything?
Well, thank you all for coming.
Do you have copies of your book?
I do. If anyone would like to obtain one, I have 6 copies with me. I'll even autograph it, free of charge. Thanks so much.
Book's $30. The autograph-
I'm thinking that we have a prophet in our midst, and I hope that we listen, and I hope that you'll go out, and I hope that you'll, for lack of a better term, maybe evangelize our position, because people need to know. I think a great example is I would walk into a theater thinking that the acting professor is going to be a left-wing
Not Joe.
guy, and we start talking, and he's the exact opposite. So spark conversations.
We're hitting.
Share the video. We're gonna distribute on YouTube. And okay, so next month, our own Salzman is going to talk about another cheerful topic, the U.S. debt crisis. And then we'll have Justice Newby in May and Amy Cook in June. We're looking to fill September and October, but we may address another familiar topic. But we're going to have Jen McGreca in November. Again, pick up a copy of The Truth and buy George's book. Thank you very much.
Chris,
Yes.